June 13, 1971. The New York Times publishes a story that will change America forever. The headline reads, Vietnam Archive, Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement. But this wasn't just another news story about the war. This was something far more dangerous. Something the most powerful government on earth had fought desperately to keep hidden. For nearly 3 decades, American presidents had lied to the public. They had sent 58,000 young men to die in a war they knew could not be won. This is the story of the Pentagon Papers. A 7,000-page classified document that exposed the biggest government cover-up in American history. And the one man who risked everything to bring the truth to light. To understand the Pentagon Papers, we need to go back to 1967. The Vietnam War is raging. Every night, American families watch their televisions as body bags come home. The official story from Washington? We're winning. Victory is just around the corner. But inside the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara knows the truth. And it's eating him alive. McNamara had been one of the war's chief architects. But by 1967, he had come to a devastating conclusion: the war was unwinnable. Worse still, it had always been unwinnable. And the government had known this from the very beginning. Haunted by this realization, McNamara makes a decision. He commissions a top-secret study. A complete history of America's involvement in Vietnam, with unlimited access to classified documents. The mission? To understand how the United States had gotten so deeply into this catastrophic war. 36 analysts. 18 months of work. Access to thousands of classified cables, memos, and military reports dating back to 1945. The result? A 7,000-page document that would become known as the Pentagon Papers. Only 15 copies were ever made. All classified top secret. McNamara's plan? Lock them away. Maybe, decades later, historians could learn from America's mistakes. But one of the analysts who worked on the study had a different idea. Daniel Ellsberg didn't look like a revolutionary. He was a former Marine. A brilliant analyst with a PhD from Harvard. A government insider who had worked at the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department. He had even spent 2 years in Vietnam, seeing the war firsthand. Ellsberg was a true believer. He thought American power could be a force for good in the world. But working on the Pentagon Papers changed him. Page by page, document by document, Ellsberg discovered that everything the American people had been told about Vietnam was a lie. President Truman had secretly aided France's attempt to recolonize Vietnam, despite claiming to support self-determination. President Eisenhower had undermined the 1954 Geneva Accords, which would have unified Vietnam through elections, because intelligence showed Ho Chi Minh would win. President Kennedy had dramatically escalated U.S. involvement, sending thousands of military advisors while publicly claiming America wasn't at war. And President Johnson? He had used a fabricated attack in the Gulf of Tonkin to justify a massive escalation, sending hundreds of thousands of troops to fight a war he privately believed was unwinnable. 4 presidents. Democrats and Republicans. All lying to the American people. All sending young men to die in a war they knew was pointless. Ellsberg was devastated. He had 2 young children. He looked at them and thought about all the Vietnamese children being killed. All the American soldiers dying for nothing. In October 1969, Ellsberg made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to copy the Pentagon Papers. All 7,000 pages. And he was going to give them to the press. Copying 7,000 pages of classified documents in 1969 wasn't simple. There were no digital files. No USB drives. Just paper. Ellsberg recruited his friend Anthony Russo and Russo's former girlfriend, Linda Siné, who had access to a Xerox machine at an advertising firm. Night after night, they worked in secret. Ellsberg would smuggle documents out of the Rand Corporation safe in his briefcase. They'd drive to the advertising firm after everyone had gone home. Then they'd spend hours feeding page after page through the copier. Sometimes Ellsberg's children came along, sleeping on the floor while their father committed what the government would call treason. It took months. The stress was unbearable. Every time Ellsberg took documents from Rand, he risked being caught. The penalty for stealing classified information? Decades in federal prison. But Ellsberg had crossed a line. He had decided that the American people's right to know the truth was more important than his freedom. More important than his career. More important than his life as he knew it. By early 1970, Ellsberg had his copies. Now came the hard part, finding someone brave enough to publish them. Ellsberg first approached members of Congress. Surely, elected officials would want to expose how the government had lied about the war, right? Wrong. Senator after senator turned him down. They were afraid. Afraid of being labeled unpatriotic. Afraid of handling stolen classified documents. Afraid of the political consequences. Frustrated but undeterred, Ellsberg turned to the press. In March 1971, he contacted Neil Sheehan, a reporter for the New York Times who had covered Vietnam. Sheehan was interested. Very interested. In a hotel room, Ellsberg showed Sheehan portions of the Pentagon papers. Sheehan immediately understood their significance. This wasn't just a big story. This was the biggest story of the decade. Sheehan took the documents back to New York. The Times assembled a secret team of reporters and editors. They rented a hotel suite and worked around the clock, verifying the documents and preparing articles. The Times lawyers were terrified. They warned that publishing classified documents could destroy the newspaper. The government might prosecute. Sources might dry up. The Times could be finished. But the Times publisher, Arthur Oakes Sulzberger, made the call. The public's right to know outweighed the risks. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published its first article based on the Pentagon Papers. The government's reaction was swift and brutal. President Richard Nixon was furious. Now, here's the irony, the Pentagon Papers covered 1945 to 1968. Nixon wasn't even in office for any of the events described. The papers made Democrats look bad, not Republicans. Nixon's advisors told him to stay quiet. Let the Democrats take the heat. But Nixon had a problem. If the Times could publish classified documents about Vietnam, what else might leak? Nixon's own secrets about Cambodia? About Laos? About his plans to escalate the war? Nixon decided to make an example of the New York Times. On June 15, just 2 days after the first article, the Justice Department obtained a court order forcing the Times to stop publishing. For the first time in American history, the federal government had imposed prior restraint on a newspaper. The First Amendment was under direct attack. But the Times had only published 3 of the 47 articles they'd prepared. Ellsberg still had the documents. And he wasn't going to let the story die. Ellsberg immediately contacted the Washington Post. Could they continue publishing while the Times fought in court? The Post's editors and lawyers debated through the night. Publisher Katharine Graham had to make an impossible choice. The Post was about to go public on the stock market. Publishing the papers could tank the offering and destroy the company. But Graham had principles. At 11 p.m. on June 17, she gave the order, publish. The next day, the Post's first Pentagon Papers story hit the stands. The government immediately sued the Post too. Now it was a constitutional crisis. 2 of America's most prestigious newspapers, silenced by their own government. The question would go to the Supreme Court: does the First Amendment protect the press's right to publish classified information in the public interest? The future of American democracy hung in the balance. On June 26, 1971, the Supreme Court heard arguments in New York Times Company v. United States. The government's position was simple: publishing classified documents endangered national security. The president has the power to keep secrets. The press must be stopped. The newspaper's argument was equally simple: the First Amendment exists precisely to allow the press to check government power. The Pentagon Papers revealed government lies, not legitimate secrets. The public had a right to know. Outside the Supreme Court, protesters gathered. Some supported the newspaper's right to publish. Others accused the Times and Post of treason. Inside the court, 9 justices held the fate of American press freedom in their hands. 4 days later, on June 30, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. 6-3 in favor of the newspapers. The government's prior restraint was unconstitutional. The Times and Post could publish. Justice Hugo Black wrote in his opinion, "The press was to serve the governed, not the governors." The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. It was a landmark victory for the First Amendment. For journalism. For democracy itself. But for Daniel Ellsberg, the fight was just beginning. While the Supreme Court battle raged, the FBI had been hunting for the leaker. Ellsberg had gone underground after the first articles appeared. He and his wife Patricia moved from safe house to safe house, staying ahead of federal agents. On June 28, Ellsberg decided he'd run long enough. He called a press conference and turned himself in. The government threw the book at him. 12 felony counts, including espionage and conspiracy. If convicted on all counts, Ellsberg faced 115 years in prison. The trial of Daniel Ellsberg became a national spectacle. Was he a hero who exposed government lies? Or a traitor who endangered national security? But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. President Nixon wasn't satisfied with prosecuting Ellsberg in court. He wanted to destroy him completely. Nixon ordered his staff to find dirt on Ellsberg. Anything that could be used to discredit him. When they couldn't find anything damaging enough, Nixon's team decided to create it. In September 1971, a group of former CIA operatives calling themselves the Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. They were looking for medical records that could be used to smear Ellsberg's reputation. They found nothing useful. But the break-in would later become crucial evidence in Ellsberg's trial. Because what Nixon's team didn't realize was that their illegal activities weren't just about Ellsberg anymore. The Plumbers would go on to commit another break-in. At the Watergate Hotel. Ellsberg's trial began in January 1973. The government's case seemed solid. Ellsberg admitted copying the documents. He admitted giving them to the press. The law seemed clear. But then, something extraordinary happened. The judge learned about the break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Government prosecutors had withheld this information from the defense. That was misconduct. Then came another revelation: the FBI had illegally wiretapped Ellsberg's phone conversations. More government misconduct. Then, in an almost unbelievable twist, the judge learned that E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, 2 of the Watergate burglars, were the same men who had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. The government's case against Ellsberg was connected to the Watergate scandal that was bringing down President Nixon. On May 11, 1973, Judge William Matthew Byrne Jr. made his ruling. All charges against Daniel Ellsberg were dismissed. The reason? Gross government misconduct. Ellsberg walked out of the courthouse a free man. The government's campaign to destroy him had failed. But more than that, the Pentagon Papers had sparked a chain of events that would topple a president. Nixon's paranoia about leaks had led to the creation of the Plumbers. The Plumbers had committed Watergate. Watergate would force Nixon to resign in August 1974. The Pentagon Papers had done more than expose lies about Vietnam. They had exposed the dark heart of executive power in America. So what exactly did the Pentagon Papers reveal? The documents showed that President Johnson had escalated the war in Vietnam while lying to Congress and the public about his plans. They showed that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which Johnson used to justify sending combat troops to Vietnam, had been misrepresented. The August 4, 1964, attack on U.S. ships. It probably never happened. They showed that the government's internal assessments of the war were far more pessimistic than what they told the American people. Privately, officials admitted the war was a stalemate. Publicly, they claimed victory was near. They showed that the U.S. had secretly bombed Cambodia and Laos without congressional authorization. Most damning of all, they showed that this pattern of deception had continued across 4 administrations, spanning more than 20 years. 58,220 Americans died in Vietnam. More than 2 million Vietnamese died. How many of those deaths could have been prevented if the government had told the truth? If presidents had been honest about the war being unwinnable? We'll never know. But the Pentagon Papers made clear that those deaths weren't the result of noble mistakes. They were the result of deliberate lies. The Pentagon Papers changed America. They shattered public trust in government. Before the papers, most Americans believed their leaders were honest. After, a generation learned to question authority. They proved the importance of whistleblowers. Ellsberg became a model for future leakers, from Chelsea Manning to Edward Snowden. For better or worse, he showed that one person could challenge the most powerful government on earth. They affirmed the power of a free press. The Supreme Court's decision protecting the Times and Post remains one of the strongest defenses of the First Amendment ever written. And they helped end the Vietnam War. While the war wouldn't officially end until 1975, the Pentagon Papers accelerated the collapse of public support. The documents made it impossible for the government to keep claiming the war was winnable. But perhaps most importantly, the Pentagon Papers taught Americans a hard lesson: governments lie. Even democracies. Even America. The question isn't whether our leaders will lie to us. The question is whether we have the systems in place, the free press, the whistleblowers, the courts, to catch them when they do. Daniel Ellsberg spent the rest of his life as an anti-war activist and advocate for government transparency. He never regretted releasing the Pentagon Papers. In interviews, he said his only regret was not doing it sooner. If he had released the papers in 1965 instead of 1971, he believed thousands of lives could have been saved. Ellsberg died in June 2023, at the age of 92. To the end, he remained convinced that citizens have not just a right, but a duty to resist government lies. His last message to the world? It's worth doing. And there's no penalty that isn't worth enduring, to do what you believe is right. The Pentagon Papers remain one of the most important document leaks in American history. They exposed how the United States had lied its way into the longest war in its history at that time. They showed how power corrupts, even in democracies. They proved that the truth, no matter how dangerous, will eventually come to light. Today, copies of the Pentagon Papers are publicly available. You can read them yourself. All 7,000 pages of America's secret history. But here's the unsettling question: what are today's Pentagon Papers? What is our government hiding right now that, decades from now, we'll look back on with shame? What lies are being told at this very moment? And who will be brave enough to expose them? The Pentagon Papers taught us that secrecy and democracy cannot coexist. That truth, eventually, will not be denied. But the price of truth is eternal vigilance. Daniel Ellsberg paid that price. He risked his freedom, his career, his life. The question is, would you? If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more covered-up crimes that shook America. Next time, we investigate the CIA's secret torture program and the whistleblower who exposed it.